Part 1. Laying the Foundation. The 5 Market Influencers. Industry Rivalry. Industry rivalry influences the market, but is in turn also highly influenced by the other 4 market influencers. It is important to keep in mind here that industry rivalry does not just correspond to the number of competitors, but also to the way in which these competitors interact with each other. As you may have guessed, the language services industry is a little different in this regard. The industry seems to be driven by a number of unwritten rules that are taken for granted by industry insiders, but can be absolutely baffling to an outsider. These unwritten rules are influenced by a number of factors: LSP Concentration Ratio, innovation and competitive advantage, marketing expenditure, competitive strategy, transparency, and the small town effect. In the following sections, we dive deeper into each of these factors to see how they influence rivalry in the language services industry. LSP Concentration Ratio. The most influential factor affecting competition is the LSP Concentration Ratio. It is a measure of how concentrated the total amount of business is with a small number of firms. Fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here and to find a way to measure it ourselves. We can rely on a useful tool that is widely used to measure firm concentration ratio, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. The Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is a way of measuring concentration among players in an industry. It is calculated by squaring each player's total market share and then adding all of these together. A higher number will mean the industry is very concentrated. The higher the number, the closer the market is to a monopoly. A lower number indicates that the market is more decentralized and therefore more competitive. HHI is a well-known measure for market concentration and is used by private businesses as well as government and regulatory agencies to measure market concentration. For example, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department uses HHI to decide whether or not to approve mergers that could potentially limit competition in an industry. The language services industry has an HHI index of 67. This seems pretty high, right? Well, we may have forgotten to mention that the HHI index is on a scale of 1 to 10,000. Generally speaking, a score from 1,500 to 2,500 is considered to be a moderately concentrated market, while any score above 2,500 is considered to be a concentrated market. The language services industry is not fragmented. It is completely pulverized. You would be hard-pressed to find a less concentrated market. If you take the top 20 players in the industry, they represent less than 5% of the whole market for language services. Compare this, for example, to the personal computer industry, in which only the top 6 companies make up almost 80% of the total market share. There is no one single player or group of players that comes anywhere close to controlling the language services industry. Even in an industry where mergers and acquisitions are a pretty common occurrence, the market has only gotten more decentralized with the passage of time. Low barriers to entry, the Jello effect, and continuously decreasing costs of running an international business are some factors that ensure sustained, healthy competition. The top companies can grow and acquire competitors, but they will never catch up with the ever-increasing demand in the industry. And we will continue to see small LSPs entering the market and ensuring that the LSP concentration remains low. What this means for LSPs is that there will always be competition. Always. Most large LSPs have accepted this and have long ago given up any dreams of overtaking the market. In the language services industry, LSPs do not compete at the industry level. Considering the level of competition in the industry as a whole, that would be madness. LSPs compete at the niche level. By carefully defining their niche, LSPs are able to shrink the overwhelming amount of competition to a more manageable level. Innovation and competitive advantage. To discuss how LSPs compete with each other through innovation, we must first describe the landscape in which we find ourselves and the prevailing attitudes towards innovation in the industry. It seems that any LSP that is able to scrape together a small R&D budget immediately starts dreaming on how they are going to revolutionize the industry with their innovative new technology or process. Go to any localization conference around the world and listen to the frothy-mouthed presenters swearing up and down that they're going to disrupt the industry with their controversial and ambitious new ideas. Like many other industries, we worship faithfully at the altar of the almighty innovation. The problem is that the language services industry has proven itself to be horribly equipped to actually innovate in any meaningful way. Still, this doesn't stop anybody from talking about it. Those of us who have been around for a little while recognize these boasts for what they are, which is nothing more than delusions of grandeur. Some actually believe that they are going to change the industry by bringing new innovation. There are the true believers. There are others, though, that realize deep down that it is all just a show. They need to talk about innovation in order to get the attention of their clients and to build the perception that they are innovative. The only thing more important than actually innovating, so it is thought, is that other people think that you are innovating. One of the worst things that can happen to an LSP is to be labeled an unbeliever. Customers don't want to work with LSPs that are happy with the status quo. They want to work with LSPs that are driving innovation in the industry. They want to work with the true believers. And so it is in this environment where we find that not only must we play along, but we must also not be caught speaking ill of any innovation, no matter how absurd and no matter what the source. Somebody has found a way to reduce costs by training cybernetically enhanced catfish to process XML files? Awesome! Tell me more. What this does is create an echo chamber in the industry, with nobody willing to speak out and express skepticism. This is especially strange because it means that even LSPs that are directly competing with each other are too afraid to speak ill of their competitors' technology, out of fear of being labeled an unbeliever. You can surely see how this affects the industry rivalry. Let's say your primary competitor gives a presentation at a conference showing their automated, no-touch, crowdsource-supported neural machine translation platform, which of course is in the cloud and optimized for mobile for some goddamn reason. Note, we made that example up, but it is not too far-fetched compared to some of the ridiculous stuff we have heard at conferences. We could provide real-life examples, but would like to avoid libel lawsuits as much as possible. Now they end their presentation and ask for questions from the audience. What you want to do is raise your hands and scream at the top of your lungs, "Bullshit." But you don't. There are poor, gullible clients present, and they are believing every word that your competitor just said, so you say nothing. Months later, you are talking to your client. They mention they saw this presentation and ask you what you think. This is your opportunity. You've been working with this client for years and have built a high level of trust with them. You should let them know they can't trust a word of what they heard, but you don't. Instead, you claim that you found the presentation inspiring and that your company is also working on something similar and you're very excited about this. All hail innovation. This is the environment in the language services industry. In some ways, it could be considered highly competitive, with each LSP shouting that they have the best and most innovative tools and processes. In other ways, it is not competitive at all, because most of these proprietary technologies are at worst completely useless or at best on par with or only marginally better than third-party software already available to all LSPs. The reality is that two players drive real innovation in the industry: customers and startups. Most established LSPs do not drive innovation because they just cannot afford to. They are focused on growing their business and hitting margin targets, and therefore they're reluctant to make any real investment into research and development. Customers drive innovation because they can afford to. Hell, if Amazon can afford a space program, we think they can afford to throw a few dollars towards developing MT engines. If LSPs are lucky, the customer will invite them to participate in this process. Startups, on the other hand, drive innovation because they have to. By their very nature, startup companies do not have the millions of dollars in R&D budget that their customers do, but they have something that most customers don't: flexibility and fresh ideas. Those massive customers that can afford to spend millions on innovation are unwieldy giants. Typically, by the time that they get to that size, they have lost most, if not all, of their organizational agility and ability to follow through on fresh and innovative ideas. Startups are smaller, more agile, and more passionate. And so while they may not have the same budget, they drive innovation if for no other reason than because they must. Marketing expenditure. Typically, in the language services industry, there are not too many high-cost marketing channels. Of course, every company has a website, That website may host various marketing materials such as blogs, videos, or webinars. Marketing departments may craft email campaigns targeted to their customers, but typically most marketing content is pretty generic in order to appeal to the widest possible audience and rarely contains any life-changing new information. As a result, it is usually pretty inexpensive to roll out. The point is, nobody is taking out full-page ads in the New York Times or buying airtime during the Olympics. Such marketing channels certainly add value in lead generation, but for language services, the majority of the sales and marketing happens in person. This is an industry of relationships. The vast majority of lead generation and new client acquisition happens in person at conferences. For this reason, the majority of most LSPs' marketing budgets goes into travel expenses to make sure their companies are well represented at these events. Attendance at conferences such as Taos and Localization World or Loc World is pretty much mandatory if an LSP wants to stay relevant in the industry. Every conference that you do not attend means not only that you are missing out on the opportunity to build relationships with potential new clients, but it also means that your existing clients are there alone. And we can guarantee that your competitors are inviting them out to dinner in your absence. The key thing to understand is that it is absolutely critical for the LSP to make this investment into building relationships through in-person contact with their clients. When we look at the core functions in Part 2, we will discuss in much greater detail how the sales core function contributes to the value chain through relationship building and education. Localization can be incredibly complex, and many customers, as we so eloquently put earlier, have no idea what the hell they are doing. Salespersons add value by consulting and educating these customers so that they can understand what they are buying and why they are buying it. It is absolutely critical for LSPs to invest in their sales core function. At this point, we feel it may be necessary to point out an observation we have made through the years in the industry. We shouldn't have to point this out, but unfortunately we do. Here goes. The companies that grow the fastest are the companies that invest the most in sales and marketing and employ the most salespersons. Makes sense, right? Well, even though this seems like common sense, it needs to be reiterated because in the language services industry, there are a lot of companies that for some reason do not understand this simple concept. Sometimes this is by design. It makes sense, for example, to not grow too fast or by pursuing the wrong type of clients, and every LSP is free to follow their own growth strategy. However, if growth is your goal, then it may be time to hire more salespersons. Send them off to build relationships and continue to invest into sales and marketing to sustain growth. Competitive strategy. One of the things that strikes outsiders when they attend language industry events is that competitors, subcontractors, and freelance translators are friendly and collaborative. There are very few bitter rivalries, no Coke versus Pepsi feuds. Mostly, this is because there is so much diversification in the industry. Sure, the industry is highly fragmented, but there are so many unique niches that most LSPs don't compete with each other. In fact, they may even be incentivized to cooperate with each other to a certain extent. When we speak at conferences or have workshops, we bring hundreds of people from dozens of companies together in the same room. Even with a large amount of people in attendance, very seldom do we find people who compete directly with one another. There is so much diversification. True competition is rare. It is more likely that you are going to collaborate with people in the room than to compete with them. In other industries, companies compete against each other as if they were two soccer teams trying to win a match. It is very clear who the competition is, and the single goal is to make sure you score more goals than they do. In the language services industry, you are still somewhat competing against the opposing team, but they are not the true opponents. The real opponents are baseball, hockey, and basketball. While you are trying to beat the opposing team, you are also working together to steal customers away from other sports. Sometimes we need to collaborate with the companies we think are our competitors, and other times we need to compete with companies we think are the collaborators. About 10 years ago, Renato gave the closing remarks at a conference in Córdoba, Argentina. As Renato tells the story, there were probably 800 people in the room, which is to say, there were probably 400. The attendees in the room were from different Argentinian LSPs. As Renato remembers, they were very shy at the conference, and he could tell that they did not collaborate with each other outside of seeing each other at conferences. They saw each other as competitors. Renato raised a few eyebrows when he told them that they were thinking small. They have the most advanced education system in the Americas. They have high English proficiency. They have the smartest, most well-educated people. He probably also commented on the looks of their women. He told them their competition is not the person sitting next to them, but the guy in Mexico, Uruguay, or Panama, who speaks Spanish and are competing directly with all of them. In the industry, we know that the Argentine translator is better educated than the rest of Latin America. If you disagree, then just remember, he was speaking to very specific people in the audience. Their goal should be to work together to create a brand. They should start branding all of their translations as translated in Argentina. Rather than compete with each other, they should collaborate so that they, as a group, could better compete with their true competitors in the industry. You will know that your brand is successful when somebody in Peru starts branding their translations translated in Argentina. Well, they didn't take this advice, at least not right away. However, what they did do years later was create an open association that provides a local community for Argentinian LSPs. They can cooperate and support each other through networking and translated in Argentina conferences. They have decided to stop competing and start collaborating. The spirit of rivalry in the language services industry is essentially one of co-opetition. Even when you are competing with somebody directly, it makes sense to cooperate to a certain extent. It is completely plausible that CEOs of rival companies are competing for the same multi-million-dollar contract one week and then speaking on the same panel at an industry conference the next week. When two LSPs are both working for the same LSP, they work together. They try to impress the client with their spirit of cooperation rather than competition. LSPs that have been around for a while know full well about the concept of coopetition, even if they have never used that specific term. Transparency and the small town effect. In many ways, working in this industry is like living in a small town. This can often be intimidating to industry outsiders, because anybody who has watched a few old Western movies has an idea of how outsiders are treated. Sometimes it seems like everybody knows each other, for better or worse. It is an industry where many celebrities are born, and people brag about who they know and how long they have known them. Growing up in a small town is much the same. Even if you don't know everybody personally, chances are that you know of them, or you know somebody who does. Working in the language services industry is like dating in a small town. There is a limited pool of companies to work for, and let's just say that there is a large degree of cross-pollination going on. It seems that everybody has worked with everybody else at some point in their career. If they haven't, then they know somebody who has, and people are more than willing to talk about their past experiences. So it is particularly important to make sure to keep your nose clean in this industry. In a small town, secrets only last until the next church potluck, and then the whole town knows about them. Likewise, in the language services industry, you will not have secrets, period. You may be able to fool industry outsiders for a little while, but not for long. It also means that there is a certain insular nature to it all. In a small town, you don't sit down and write a resume. You get a job because your uncle manages the Pizza Hut on Main Street. Likewise, language services are all about who you know and, more importantly, the impression you make on them. What you think of the small town effect is largely a matter of perception. Some use words like networking, others use words like nepotism. Some say insular, others say close-knit. It is not our point here to be preachy and calling attention to this. It is our point to point out a prevalent phenomenon in the industry and to let you think what you want of it. How does this affect industry rivalry? Well, like in a small town, people talk. And your standing in the community is your greatest asset. So LSPs are always careful to make sure they maintain a good reputation, not just with their customers, but with everybody.